So Ian, I know you've asked this question to 49 other artists. It's time for you to answer it. Are there any particular events or personal family histories that brought you to being interested in making art?
Really, I think it all began with the National Geographic magazine. And so I spent hours as a kid reading old copies of the National Geographic. Our household tended to have old copies of everything, so old copies of the National Geographic. And one thing about those issues, these are probably from the mid-30s through the 40s, is that they depended more on paintings and drawn illustrations than they did on photography as such. Photography in those days was mostly black and white, so if you wanted to tell a story, with some sense of excitement, then you told it with painting. So these paintings could be very, very active, and so I was absorbed by these. I was also absorbed actually by reading the Saturday comics in the paper, what absorbed me was the way characters could be constructed just through the act of drawing, far more than anything I experienced through photography, for instance. So really was drawn to these kinds of expressions through art, since both the comics and the National Geographic illustrations were essentially art. So that was perhaps a pretty formative influence. So if we speed forward a little bit, and now I'm in university, drawing for me when I was a kid, 12, 13, 14, was a marvelous way of finding out how you make things, how you make form. And I used to haunt the art bookstore in Ottawa, and buy these pamphlets on how to draw a face and figure and so on. And I practiced this with my friends, and I became more and more adept at making something real out of drawing a friend. They were very patient with me, I have to say. Anyway, so there was that. If I fast forward, I should also say that as I thought about drawing friends, of course I'm not talking about a real subject in a round, and I became more and more interested in how you look at something from the other side than what you would find in a painting or drawing. So I became also interested in making sculptures, and I made lots of little figurative sculptures, thinking of my National Geographic images. And so, but if I fast forward to university, which I'm older and thinking, I wasn't really thinking about being an artist. I was actually thinking about being a historian. I was studying history at Queen's. And in terms of art, I came to love the cover illustrations of the Saturday Evening Post, which was essentially Norman Rockwell, and I became enthusiastic about Norman Rockwell. And what I loved about Rockwell was, well, of course, his incredible ability to tell a story visually, but also the sense that one had from Rockwell that it wasn't enough simply to draw a drawing or paint a picture. What was important was that drawing or picture was promoting something, was actually trading on an idea. In Rockwell's case, it was an idea about beautiful America, of course, the soul of a country in its best iteration. So I was quite moved by that, and that brought me, when I was at university, it brought me in contact with Bertolt Brecht's notion of theater. And the bringing together of the means of production, well, Brechtian theaters, bringing together the means of producing the play with the story that the play actually is carrying. And that was, I embraced that enthusiastically, you might say, because German was my minor, which is why I was studying Brecht. And so by the time I was ending my studies in history at Queen's, history, of course, is a very interesting subject in itself, but fraught with stories and moral dilemmas and such. But by the time I'd finished my studies at Queen's, I was really starting to think about being an artist. So what circumstance brought me to being an artist? Oh, let me say Norman Rockwell.
What do you think an artist does?
Oh, I'm sure every artist has a different story on that one. But from my own point of view, I think that, again, I'm going to work out Brecht a little bit here, in the sense that the means of production and the production itself have a relationship. And I think that that my idea of what an artist can do, at any rate, is to take things apart in the act of putting them back together. Or one could reverse that and say that in putting something together, one has to bear in mind what it would take to take it apart. And I think that what art can do is to demonstrate that relationship, the innate relationship between something that is formed and apparently seamless, and what would constitute it in its parts, in its disassembly, and how that disassembly would reconfigure what it would be to put it back together. Kind of like the old saw about if I take the clock apart and I then put it back together, I may end up with parts that I can't figure out where they would go. But in that, we see something that wasn't the same, or that what I have now isn't necessarily the same as what I had then. And that the fact that something can be in different configurations, it can be different, though it is the same, is an important sense of what would constitute change in the world, what would allow that idea of, what is an artist supposed to do? It's supposed to change the world. Well, you can change the world simply by taking a clock apart, not being able to put it together the same way it was when it was together before.
Can you think of a work that might relate to that? Just a quick reference?
In a way, I think that most of my work has revolved around this idea of what constitutes the facticity of something. And particular work, in some respects, when you take, let's say, the archive is something that is of great interest these days. When you take a work that already exists, maybe we could take, a recent example might be from 2 or 3 years ago, a work that I did called Prose and Poetry in England, which is simply the title of a relatively old book now of English poetry and prose. But I titled that work Prose and Poetry of England intentionally, so I'm borrowing, taking over the title of the book. And in particular to showcase a work by a British poet who was in fact the poet laureate of England at the time, John Masefield. The poem was called Carr. So actually the work is, you might say, a replay of Carr, the poem, which is a poem in 3 stanzas. And what I've done there is to take something that every schoolgirl, for instance, would study in school, perhaps no longer, but they did at the time, and take it apart from its original form, which was simply a poem in a book, and reconstruct it as a 3-dimensional installation in 3 parts to follow the poem, and enable that poem to become something else. And in the fact that it became something else, it also embodies what it was before. I'm talking about the title of the work, which is also the title of the anthology that the poem is in. I'm not sure if that's an illustration that gives a sense of that, but that's certainly one that comes to mind.
I'd like to read you a quote. And from that quote, I'd really like you to discuss what you think or what you could describe as the core idea behind your work. And this is from Philip Monk's catalogue from the power plant. Within the divided trace of an already inscribed, Carr's work registers a double movement. On the one hand, they present themselves as a falling away and a disinvestment of the sign from an absent referent, an original plentitude of an always already deferred repetition, which on the other hand leaves in its place a trace that is doubled or retraced in our abandonment by or retouching.
Well, Phil. Okay, trace. Yes, that's a good reminder of something that I've thought about over the years. What is a trace? A trace is something that's left behind, something that has been marked, and some agency has made a mark and left a trace. I often think actually of Freud's magic writing book, which we used as a kids, where you could write on writing magic pad. You write on it, and you pull the acetate off, and you put it back down, and the writing had disappeared. But the writing is still there. It's just that you can't see it any longer. And of course, a blackboard, if you rub out a blackboard, the trace of the chalk is still there. Anyway, trace is very important. Was a very important concept for me. It still is, in the sense that there's a kind of ghost that lives on. Whatever you might say, whatever you might change, nonetheless, the ghost remains.
Would you say that is in relationship to the way that you work with materials and ideas?
I'm not sure about the question. Let me think about the question of materials and ideas. Let me come to that through the notion of the theatre set, so the theatre set for me is an interesting embrace of the materiality by which the set is constructed, and the idea that the set is meant to support. So the relationship between, as I said with respect to Brecht, the relationship between the set and the performance is a symbiotic one. You can't really pull them apart. Well, you can have different sets, of course, but always the set, whatever it might be, is related to the performance. So if we reverse that thought, so we can talk about idea and material in that respect being, you can't pull them apart, being symbiotic, as I said. But if you reverse that and you talk about the relationship that one has to a performance, then the fact is that when we have seen a performance, we leave the theatre, we think about it afterwards, there's a trace of that performance in our memory. We remember a performance and the set that went with it. And it's that sense of the trace that actually, in many respects, is what we take away. It's the takeaway, you might say, from any artwork or any experience. So you could say trace and memory are connected concepts. And in terms of how I've dealt with this idea of trace, I've thought of the work as constructing an experience that remains after the experience of the work, that one wants that trace to remain. And one of the things that's important about that is sense of touch, that we touch something through the trace. A trace itself is a touch. The touch on something leaves a trace. But our experience of something as a trace is something that we can touch, something that we can hold on to.
How do you work? How do you move from one body of work to another?
Well, on a practical level, I tend to see what I do in terms of a series of portfolios, you might say, a series of envelopes. What that enables me to do is to think of a work not as a series, but as a representation of a particular way of forming something, whether it's an installation, for instance, as a form, or whether it's a bookwork, whether it's a blackboard. Occasionally I bring these envelopes together. I take something out of one envelope and I put it in another envelope and make something out of that. But quite frequently I work within the specific envelope. So when I move from work to work, I'm quite frequently simply leaving one envelope behind and moving to another envelope. That's the practicalities of it. How you shift from one work to another more imaginatively or intellectually, that's a tougher question. And in some respects, I think all artworks, at least from my point of view, all artworks represent the struggle that one has with experiences that one has over many years, decades, that have produced thoughts, that produced, what can I call them? Imaginative leaps, perhaps, or simply confounding thoughts. And those thoughts, of course, would underlie any one of these, or all of these portfolios, as I call them, but that's a terrain that is incredibly difficult to pull apart, I guess.
Could you actually connect this notion of comedy or the absurd to any of your works, or your way of seeing the world, your way of trying to represent the world?
Well, comedy and absurdity have a lot in common, and they aren't particular words. Perhaps what I'm interested in, and of course I'm interested in language, because language is the means by which we both illuminate something and confound ourselves or others over what it is we're finding. So in some respects, language itself is a kind of theater of a comedic theater of the absurd, let's say. We could put it that way, maybe, I'm not sure. But the question of comedy and the absurd is deeper than either of those words. I think that one of my favorite words actually is a Latin word, conundrum. And I find that the world is filled with conundra, that things that somehow don't quite make sense, although they appear to.
Is there a particular work that you could refer to?
Well, yeah, I guess actually the odd little thing that we got on the table here, it represents a work that I'm currently starting, hopefully finishing in the next year or so. It's based upon a famous paradox, actually. So again, paradox is an interesting word. A paradox called the Ship of Theseus paradox. And very briefly speaking, the paradox works this way. Theseus brings his ship into dock A, and he has it repaired. And in the process of having prepared, the workers put the old boards from the ship into another dock, and they slowly build up the old lumber from the ship in one dock as they replace it with new lumber in the first dock, to the point where ultimately Theseus's ship has been repaired, and it's brand new, you might say, but it's his ship that's been repaired. But meanwhile, his ship has reappeared as a kind of ghost in the other dock, also fully Theseus' ship. So the paradox or conundrum, it's an ancient one, has been, well, which then is Theseus' ship? You know, how do you decide on an entity? And I'm kind of interested in conundra or paradoxes of that nature. So I'm working with that in this piece. There's another aspect to it as well, the sense of the infinite regress. Because if you do it once, you could do it twice, you could do it 3 times, you could do it any infinite number of times. Which incidentally is rather interesting in terms of Theseus' ship, because the Greeks didn't believe in infinity. But I'm interested in those kinds of conundra, and perhaps there's more to that work, of course, than what I'm just describing now. But I haven't even described the work that I'm going to do, but we'll leave that for another time.
You don't want to talk about cargoes. Well, I think when I think of that piece, I think of the satirical content.
Masefield was, of course, my interest in the poem was the sense of disproportion that Masefield seized on when he wrote the poem. So I'll just describe the poem very briefly. It's a poem in 3 stanzas. In the first stanza, it's an ancient galley that is bringing home spices from one part of the ancient world to another. So it's a ship filled with what we would think of as wonders of the senses. In the second stanza, he fast forwards to the Spanish main and Spanish galleons carrying gold and silver. Of course, we won't get into the politics just yet, but gold and silver. So again, something that is beautiful, something that is redolent with a sense of richness. In the third stanza, and last stanza, he shifts over to the British coastal ships. He's writing, of course, in the 40s and the 30s, but I'm sure they still exist. The British coastal ships that were in the business, and these were just iron-hulled workaday ships that would transport things like pig iron and tin trays around the coast of England to distribute products of industry. And of course, in cargoes, then Masefield is making a wry, humorous, but also very critical point about what has happened to civilization. It starts off with, the wonders of the senses, wonders of wealth, and the enjoyment of what we would consider luxury, and ends up in a kind of Marxist wilderness of cheap tin trays and pig iron. And so, there's a very political message here, but also very explicitly, explicitly political. What I mean is very efficient in how it's producing its thought, and you can't help but think that the key to that sense of economy is the recognition that the reader will have of the impoverishment of something, the comparison. Comparisons are very important, comparators. And that comparative can produce a sense of wry humor, while at the same time, of course, delivering its political message.
Is art history, does that in any way play a role in your...
Art history? Well, you can't get away from art history, and of course, as an exhibiting artist, you're right in it. So one can't help but think art history, because you're part of that discourse, and art history, of course, is not just the top 12 artists of all time, but is the discourse that goes through generations artists and those who think about art have a conversation over the centuries. So one is a part of that. Whether I think about art history much further than thinking of myself as enveloped in that discourse, well, of course I pay attention to specific artists, which changes from time to time, though there are some artists that you just can't get away from, like Duchamp, for instance. But art history as such is a discourse I'm engaged in, but not something that I need to think about too much.
Would you say that today, if you kind of do a mental survey, there is such a thing as a zeitgeist, contemporary zeitgeist?
You don't have to travel very far to be aware of something that might be called zeitgeist. You just have to be on any one or any number of the media outlets to be aware of the world itself. It comes in your head all the time. Zeitgeist. Okay, what I derive from my relationship to the world through these media is that there is no zeitgeist. That is to say, there's no single zeitgeist. That there are many different zeitgeists, if you want, spirits of the time, all competing with one another. And the question then becomes, well, just what is one to make of all of this? I think that what comes through to me is the diversity of experiences that we are now in contact with in a way that was not really so readily available, and certainly not so powerfully presented in decades ago. If I think back to when I was younger, really the world was much simpler because the amount of information was much less. So with the degree of information that we have at our fingertips now, I think that it's almost impossible to imagine that there's a single zeitgeist. But you could say that if there is, then the zeitgeist is this competition of different voices, all clamoring for attention and delivering very different points of view about what the world is about. What is one to make of that? One comes to the conclusion that the zeitgeist really comes down to making a kind of choice about what part of that cacophony, if you want, you choose to pick up on. And because it's so diverse, you can dip into it in any number of ways. So
that conversation leads quite naturally into the question of social theory. And does theory play any role in your work?
Theory plays a role in... people, I think, overemphasize theory. I mean, it's good to read the different theories, and there's any number of different theories running around. And I have my attachments to certain theories, especially when I was teaching. But I think people forget, or they don't pick up on the fact that theorists are really just trying to make sense of this zeitgeist, as it were, from their point of view, at any one time. And so what I like about theory, what informs me about it, really is that it's an attempt, any one of them, is an attempt to make sense of experience. And a good theorist can be like an artist or a writer, can be adept at persuading you that something is important, something is good to pay attention to. And for me, that's what theory is.
Does the public play any relation in your work? In the way you think about the work, you present the work?
Well, there's not much point being an artist if you don't have a public. Well, let me say that even if you don't have a public in the here and now, if you're an artist, you hope that there will be a public in the then and there. So the public is absolutely essential to the idea of the artist, whether you have the public right at the moment or not. So yeah, of course I think that the public is important. What do I do about the public? I'm not sure there's much I can do about the public. What I can do is pay attention to the fact that I do want to talk to somebody. I'm talking to somebody, that's the public. And I want to be as articulate, I want to be as persuasive, I suppose you could say, as I can, in order to have anyone in the public, whether it's now, here, or then, have them pay attention to something and have something to latch onto, have something that keys something to them. I think that's what my relationship to the public is.
I know you've been teaching for many years, and you're well respected and professor to your students. I adore you. And you keep in touch with them. Mm-hmm. Over the years, you've kept in touch with quite a few of your students. Mm-hmm. What would you say you take away from the experience of being a teacher, teaching in programs, many of which you've actually founded yourself?
Well, okay, so teaching comes in a number of packages. That question of founding a program is an interesting one because being a teacher enables you to, in some sense, be a leader in putting something on the table. And so what is developing a program at a university but putting something on the table for all of us to sort of sit at and enjoy? So there's that part of being a teacher. And what is a student? They're somebody who has something to think about and to say, and they brought their thinking and their saying into a particular form, the classroom, if you want to call it that, the critique studio and so on. And it's that relationship, the relationship, a conversational relationship, one you might say, in which you have a trading of ideas, abstract ideas, but also ideas about what an artwork is. You know, how does one make an artwork? What is a successful artwork? And so on and so forth. So teaching is an amazing experience of, well, you could even say it's an amazing experience of practicing what this relationship that an artist has with the public might be, in terms of not only having somebody right in front of you with whom you're having this conversation, but in terms of, well, I'll just leave it at that.
Well, that brings me directly into the question of your relationship with curators.
I've had a lasting and, from time to time, fascinating and evolving relationship with one curator, Philip Monk, with whom you talked about earlier, or quoted earlier. And yeah, I've had a relationship with curators. Not sure what to make of that relationship. For the most part, of course, it's enjoyable to have somebody want to put your work someplace. But if I think of shows that I've been in, which of course were curated, I'm remarkably absent from the equation, except for a work that appears in an exhibition. So I don't necessarily have to have a relationship with a curator. I have a relationship with what the curator wants to do, and normally they sort of tell you what they want to do, and normally you agree, well, that's a good idea, so let's do it. I would say that's essentially my relationship to curators. I certainly respect them, and in fact, I established a program in curating at OCAD because I felt that it was very important for art students and students who come to the university because they're interested in art. Very important for there to be a discipline, a disciplined approach through which they could understand what this is. But I don't need to go any further with that.
And what about critics?
Critics. Well, this gets us into writing, and of course I like writing, and the question becomes: is there a lot of good writing being done? Again, I'd have to say that in years past, Philip has been a really interesting writer, a very particular kind of writer. We wouldn't want the world to be only Philip Mugg's brand of writing, but Philip really has produced, I think, an excellent incursion into what writing art could be. But I can't think of too many other writers, at least in my own experience, that I would place in the same arena. There's, of course, the journalists in the newspaper, some of whom are good. Margaret White's pretty good, actually, when it comes to journalism. But there aren't too many critics whose writing has been, I think, of the kind of quality that one would imagine truly critical writing could be. So.
Then the next question would be collectors.
Yes. Be nice to know some. I can't go much beyond that. I mean, it's a good idea. I'd like to know some.
I know we've talked about the zeitgeist, but would you say that there is a and the dominant discourse would be a different understanding of the reading of the world? Would you say that there is a dominant contemporary discourse, or any sort of discourse that you yourself engage in?
I'm sure there is. I'll just say I was intrigued by David Clarkson, who, when asked that same question, said, "Well, that's quite clear. It's the marketplace." So I think that's certainly one answer. I like the answer. It's not mine, though. I think that one could say that in this attempt at theory or any kind of reportage to understand the zeitgeist through some kind of lens, that the dominant discourse today would certainly be around the question of what it is we're doing to the planet. In other words, from any number of perspectives, whether it's deep denial or whether it's embrace, I think that there's a definite understanding that we're in trouble. And I think that there's a level of anxiety that works through a number of iterations. So I think that the discourse of essentially what is a discourse of the future is really a dominant one today. But from my perspective, how does that kind of filter down to what I'm interested in? What part of this dominant discourse would I be interested in? And I think that would be the question of question of subjectivity. What constitutes subjectivity, which is a question of values. What is it that we value? How do we come to value something? And once you start to talk about that, you start to ask the question: well, what are the structural requirements? What happens in the process of trying to establish value? Well, some would say, well, human nature, but a tighter attempt to deal with subjectivity would be, I think, through the various disciplines that have evolved over the last 100 years or so. Most obviously, I think, psychoanalysis and in its many different guises, I guess, around the question of what are the components of human nature, what constitutes desire, desire and guilt. In that equation, I think that major contributors would be people like Jacques Lacan, even Dave Hickey, certainly Foucault and Derrida. You can name a number of different theorists who I think have contributed to trying to figure out the subjectivity by which we pursue questions of value, and ultimately questions of how to deal with a looming future. So conversations, I think these would be the conversations that interest me.
Artists, many artists write. Do you find that artists write differently about other artists' work than let's say, a critic or an art writer, journalist? And how would you define that?
I think the easy answer for me would be the materiality, and I think that artists, can write from any number of different perspectives. But I think what I would think, and I think that in my reading of artists' writings, this is held up, that artists have a much closer sense, much more proximate sense of the relationship to making form, to actually the materiality of the world, the physicality of it, you might say even. Yeah, of course, there's a lot of critical writing around affect and the body and so on and so forth. So, but those can be pursued in quite abstract, you might say, intellectual terms. I think I think that artists, when they write, are writing from a much more close relationship to the question of the material world and how we actually can work with it. I have to say that in the past I've found, especially with curators, that they don't seem to have a real, and why would they really, a real sense of the materiality of things, for the most part. Disposition, yes, the placement of one thing against another, but these are writerly, these are writerly pursuits. They're not bodily pursuits the way I think that an artist writes.
It's difficult being an artist from the get-go. How do you persevere? How do you persevere?
Well, I think that the question of perseverance is a question of there being no alternative. That the perseverance relies on no plan B. You have to do what it is you're doing. Now that can apply to other professions, of course, as well. And I'm sure the question of perseverance and the difficulty of being whatever, philosopher perhaps, I'm sure it's a bit similar. How do you make a living as a philosopher? So I think that the question of perseverance is a question of urgency and necessity. And you rise to it, you grapple with it, you struggle with it, and you pursue what it is you want to pursue, whatever the consequences. And of course, you try to ameliorate the consequences. You try to get a day job or a good job, something to support yourself, or you figure out how to sell art. Wow, somebody should tell me how you do that. But the struggle is something that has to be mastered.
What are your views on the art system today?
The art system. Well, of course, there are many art systems, international, national, local, and so on. The art system is systems. The art systems, yes, they do have their own politics, every one of them. So you could say the art system is the same as the political position that one finds oneself in the world if you want to actually accomplish anything. I think that, of course, it's the international art system that tends to dominate people's thinking, and that's driven largely by collectors and by curators, or at least a small group of curators, who have some very specific understandings of what constitutes art at any given moment. It's hard to get a lot of purchase on these. So for myself, I found that it's much better to work with what you have in front of you. So the art system, let's say the art system represented by, I don't know, in my own case, Susan Hobbs, for instance, comes down to that. Or the art system as it comes through in a curator who wants to do something at the HEO, that kind of thing. So I think the art system is something that you work with to the means that you can. And normally speaking, you work therefore with the art system as it appears at your front door. So when the art system comes knocking at my front door, or Susan Hobbs, then that's the art system for me. And and you just work with what the person at the door is wanting to sell you.
The contemporary notion of, or the questions of the notion of originality, authenticity, and what do you make of that?
Well, again, these are words, originality and authenticity. They're powerful words, and they're kind of somewhat historical words, kind of coming from a time perhaps when the relationship between the maker and the made was really important. In other words, is this a real Picasso, or is it not a real Picasso? And so on and so forth. And was Picasso thinking of this all by himself late at night, or was he copying something from somebody else? These are the kinds of questions that have generally, historically, arisen out of originality and authenticity. And you know, they're interesting questions. I don't think that they're particularly pertinent today, because I think that we've disconnected the necessity of the relationship between the artist and the artwork. And in fact, I think that we've reattached the questions of authenticity and to some extent originality to the relationship between the artwork and the audience, between the thing and the receiver. So the artists themselves is free to kind of do practically anything now, I think, you know, as long as the relationship between the thing made, the thing, whatever that thing might be, and the receiver, the viewer, the public, as long as that relationship constructs something real, something that the receiver, the person, the audience, can feel that they can hold on to as something of value. So I think that the question of authenticity today really comes down to a question of whether something of value can be held by the person who comes to the work.